Look, we all know the ancient Earth was a wild, uncharted frontier packed with absolute monsters. The deeper you dive into the timeline, the more insane the planet gets, until you are staring at an alien landscape that looks absolutely nothing like our modern world. That is exactly why we are so obsessed with daydreaming about the ancient past, picturing what it would really feel like to step out of a time machine into that utter chaos. But let us be real for a second. If you actually had a big red button sitting right in front of you offering a one-way ticket back to the Jurassic Age, there is zero chance you would slam it. I know I would not touch the thing, because you do not need a degree to realize that primeval history was a totally merciless bloodbath ruled by some of the most hardcore beasts imaginable. We are talking colossal dinosaurs, savage saber-toothed cats, gigantic woolly mammoths, and terrifying mosasaurs. You know exactly what I am saying. The sheer scale, the unbelievable power, and the raw grit of these titans are the stuff of pure myth. But every now and then, paleontologists unearth a mind-blowing fossil that slaps us in the face and reminds us just how ruthlessly tough these creatures actually were. Usually, the ultimate crowd pleasers are the ones frozen in a deathmatch forever, like those iconic battling dinosaurs. Sure, that stuff is undeniably epic, but if you ask me, the absolute ultimate proof of prehistoric badassery comes from the survivors, the ones dragging around horrific battle wounds, nasty scars, and rotting diseases, who simply refuse to die. In a handful of absolutely crazy scenarios, these ancient warriors bounce back completely, making me feel downright pathetic for whining about a tiny needle at the doctor's office. Since these ancient beasts were built like absolute tanks, we have a massive roster of survivors to look at. But we are kicking things off with a gladiator who quite literally had its face violently ripped off. I am completely serious. Half of its head was snatched entirely away, and this absolute legend somehow kept on swimming to tell the tale. So, who is our mystery warrior? Enter the Prognathodon. Maybe that name does not ring a bell right away, but this sea monster was a heavyweight champion in the legendary Mosasaur family. We are talking about apex predators stretching 39 feet from nose to fin, weighing far more than actual whales. So yeah, an absolute titan of the deep. And even among its terrifying peers, this beast rocked ridiculously oversized jaws, powered by freakishly strong muscles, packing rows of thick, pocket knife-sized teeth that were brutally serrated to shred whatever they caught. Because of that lethal hardware, it is absolutely no surprise that this apex killer utterly dominated the late Cretaceous oceans, terrorizing waters across North America, Africa, Europe, and Australia. Looking at its savage bite, its global hunting grounds, and hard fossil evidence, experts know this. Leviathan devoured pretty much anything it wanted, with one specific fossil showing a stomach packed full of fish, squids, and massive sea turtles. Take that endless appetite, mix it with their hyper-aggressive nature, and you quickly realize these monsters were savage cannibals who gladly ripped each other to shreds. One of the most stomach-churning examples of this underwater warfare is a fossil brilliantly named NHMM 201272. Unearthed straight out of the Netherlands, this prehistoric gladiator was rocking a glaringly horrific war wound, meaning its entire face was basically gone. If we want to get specific, massive sections of its upper jaw, outer bone layers, and front snout were violently torn clean off by something with god-tier strength. Considering how incredibly huge the victim already was, scientists bet the attacker was another gigantic mosasaur. It was almost certainly a rival Prognathodon trying to make a quick cannibalistic snack out of our main character. I want you to close your eyes right now and picture the sheer, agonizing terror of having your upper jaw completely blasted into oblivion. Now add to that nightmare the fact that you are bleeding out in a primordial ocean millions of years ago without a doctor in sight. Oh, and let us not forget, you are rocking flippers instead of hands, meaning you cannot even clutch your shattered face to stop the bleeding. Your survival odds are basically zero, right? For literally anyone else, a pulverized skull like that is an instant game over, even with an entire modern hospital on standby. But for this unstoppable Prognathodon, it was just another Tuesday.
Look at the teeth on that skull.
Even with a massive gaping crater where its snout used to be.
I can't believe how big
this
the
legend
ribs are.
Miraculously kept swimming for an incredibly long time, proving it by leaving behind fossilized bone and tissue completely scarred over and heavily healed. Make no mistake though, that recovery process was pure, agonizing torture. Between the torrential blood loss, frantically screaming nerve endings, and catastrophic meat damage, the swelling was so violently extreme that it crushed its own blood vessels, literally strangling the circulation and turning parts of its face into rotting, dead flesh. As if having a zombified face was not harsh enough, the murky ocean eventually flooded that open cavern with bacteria, sparking a brutal infection. Now, even though this absolute juggernaut weathered the initial jaw-ripping trauma for a seriously long stretch, maybe even toughing it out for well over a year, it looks like that creeping bacterial sickness was the final nail in the coffin. And get this, it did not die from vital organs shutting down. The infection simply paralyzed what little was left of its jaw muscles, meaning this apex hunter tragically, slowly starved to death. But let me make this crystal clear. This absolute unit was totally fine surviving without half of its face. Relatively speaking, of course. It was just those microscopic pests that finally took down the king. So yeah, we are talking about a certified prehistoric badass. However, not every brutal mauling ends in starvation. There are ancient beasts out there that took unbelievable damage and completely bounced back to near 100%. But if we're talking about pure, unadulterated toughness, absolutely nothing touches the undisputed ruler of the ancient world, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. I'm telling you, over the decades, we've dug up countless skeletons that prove this absolute monster didn't just wear the crown, it bled for it. In fact, the most legendary fossils you already know by name, those are the exact ones, showcasing the most jaw-dropping battle scars and gnarly diseases we've ever seen. Look at Stan, an absolute giant of a T-Rex pulled from the dirt in 1987. This beast roamed the Earth 66 million years ago, stretching 11.8 meters, or 38.6 feet from snout to tail. We're talking a certified powerhouse, sitting comfortably at the absolute top of the food chain. But heavy lies the crown. Stan's bones paint a brutal picture of a life completely ravaged by vicious attacks and crippling sickness. Right out of the gate, paleontologists found massive, gaping bite marks gouged directly into the back of his head and right across his ribcage. And those holes match exactly one weapon in the entire fossil record, the crushing jaws of a rival T-Rex. That means this guy went toe-to-toe with other mega predators in blood-soaked turf wars, and literally walked away to fight another day. And these definitely weren't warning nips. They sank deep into the bone, bringing unimaginable agony. That chomp to the head, he would have suffered a staggering concussion at best, because the enemy's teeth literally punched straight through his freaking skull pattern. But incredibly, Stan shrugged that off like a minor scrape, and believe it or not, that wasn't even the closest call he had. A massive bite straight to the base of the skull reveals he actually suffered a snapped neck. I don't need to explain that getting your neck broken is usually game over immediately. For this prehistoric warlord, though, it was basically just a frustrating Tuesday. The bone miraculously fused back together while he was still out there hunting. It wasn't a pretty recovery, though. The massive trauma forced jagged bone to grow out of control, literally fusing two of his spinal blocks completely solid. He spent every single day after that dealing with agonizing stiffness and massive blind spots for the rest of his days. Which makes the fact that he kept dominating his environment just utterly mind-blowing. As if that wasn't brutal enough, he was walking around with shattered ribs from crushing blows, plus savage lacerations across his face and lower jaw. He couldn't even catch a break from the microscopic threats, either. Those bizarre circular craters dotting his snout? They prove he had flesh-eating parasites literally boring straight into his face while he was still alive. Stack all that up, and you've got a medical chart that would put absolutely any modern animal in the grave instantly. Yet Stan kept violently defending his turf and tearing down. The craziest twist in this entire saga? None of those catastrophic war wounds actually took him down. Father Time is what finally did it. He tapped out at roughly 24 years of age, an incredibly long and distinguished run for a giant carnivore. But hold on, because Stan wasn't the only tyrant king to endure absolute hell on Earth. In fact, the single most iconic skeleton we possess completely blows his story out of the water, surviving way longer through sheer, unyielding willpower despite horrific limitations. Oh yeah, we are talking about the legendary Sioux. If you know anything about the prehistoric world, that name rings loud and clear. But what nobody tells you is that ruling the Cretaceous was an absolute nightmare for them, whether they were the king or the queen. This incredible creature powered through a laundry list of catastrophic damage that absolutely should have been a guaranteed death sentence. Take the obliterated right shoulder blade, for instance. It was so mangled that the arm was essentially rendered entirely useless. On top of that, that exact same arm suffered a brutally ripped tendon along the way. Experts suspect that devastating rip happened while grappling with dinner, and remember, a T-Rex's dinner was usually a literal walking tank covered in armor and horns. In the violent chaos of that clash, Sioux also walked away with a staggering 3 shattered ribs. But because this animal was an unstoppable force of nature, those bones show massive calcification, proving she shook it off and lived years beyond that encounter. As if being beaten and broken wasn't enough, Sue was fighting a silent war against her own failing body. Her left leg bone had swollen to grotesque proportions, and several bones in her tail had welded themselves together. We're talking about multiple, raging bacterial infections attacking from the inside out. That monstrous tail wasn't just infected. Years of relentless physical trauma had left it crippled by severe bone-grinding arthritis. Throw in glaring evidence of gout and excruciatingly painful joint disease, and every single step must have been absolute torture. And for the ultimate horrifying detail? Just like her counterpart Stan, Sue's jawline was completely riddled with bizarre, gaping voids. Originally, scientists figured these were just battle scars from rival predators, or some kind of weird bone rot. But once they dug deeper, the actual reality turned out to be pure nightmare fuel. She was playing host to a massive colony of flesh-boring parasites that literally tunneled through her face, devouring the solid bone of her jaw while she was fully awake. When you look at this horrific laundry list of trauma, the fact that she was even drawing breath is a miracle, let alone dominating the landscape. But absolutely nothing could keep her down. She grew into a colossal titan, stretching past 40 feet, that's 12.3 meters, and tipping the scales at an earth-shaking 14 tons. That kind of bulk makes a modern African elephant look like a total joke. And as the ultimate flex against a universe trying to kill her, she kept defying death year after year. She didn't drop until the ripe old age of 33. In dinosaur years, that makes her an absolute ancient elder. To this day, she remains the oldest Tyrannosaurus we have ever pulled from the rock. If that isn't the definition of a legendary, battle-hardened survivor, nothing is. But seriously, it wasn't just the apex predators getting absolutely mangled out there in the prehistoric wild. We've got a massive vault of wild dinosaur battle scars to talk about, and while I definitely plan on diving back into that chaotic world later, listen up, because there is no way we are leaving our own mammalian ancestors out of this epic saga. Our family tree survived some absolutely unbelievable nightmares, kicking off with those legendary prehistoric humans who were, without a doubt, forged from entirely different steel. If you have caught my previous stories, you already know that Neanderthals were pure, unadulterated, hardcore survivors. But absolutely no discovery cements that legendary status quite like Shanidar One. We affectionately call him Nandy, and in my book, this guy holds the undisputed title of the most indestructible hominin ever pulled from the dirt. Let me paint the picture for you. Nandy was a rugged survivor from roughly 45 to 65,000 years ago, battling the elements in a cave located in modern-day Iraq. His existence was so overwhelmingly brutal that the archaeologists who dug him up instantly spotted a skeleton warped by pure trauma. Now, savage brutality was just a standard Tuesday for anyone walking the earth back then, and that merciless environment absolutely delivered the first of many devastating blows to our guy, starting with a massive, skull-crushing impact suffered in his youth, likely from a brutal smash with a heavy prehistoric club. Believe me, this was not some clumsy trip and fall. This was an intentional, terrifying strike, straight to the left hemisphere of his skull. The sheer force obliterated his left eye socket, plunging that eye into permanent darkness, and simultaneously handed him a catastrophic, lifelong brain injury. This severe trauma totally derailed his physical development, and completely scrambled the neural pathways controlling the entire right half of his body. That profound neurological damage practically guaranteed partial paralysis, setting off a horrific chain reaction that resulted in his right arm and leg becoming severely withered and practically useless. A nightmare scenario that some experts also pin on a brutal degenerative disease. Surviving in the prehistoric wild with a half-paralyzed body was an unimaginable hell, leaving him incredibly vulnerable to a relentless onslaught of falls and attacks. You can literally read this tragic history in his mangled arms, which show undeniable proof of being
we look closely at the
snapped like
parameters
twigs in multiple
established
different
here.
spots,
Notice
likely
the
from vicious
significant
tumbles,
cracks on this
permanently
particular
wrecking whatever
fossil.
muscle power he had left. But here is where his legendary resilience shines. He actually survived those breaks, even though the relentless trauma ultimately cost him his lower right arm and hand. The evidence even hints at a primitive, mind-blowing surgical amputation. So, our man Nandy is already living a waking nightmare. But brace yourselves, because we are barely scratching the surface of his grueling medical record. Scanning down to his foundation,
sagittal views
the bones in
utilize
both of his
spectral
legs
CT
were
data,
completely
shown
fractured,
here in blue,
either in
green,
one
and
catastrophic
red,
event
to clearly
or a
delineate
series of
the precise-
agonizing disasters. We will probably never know what monstrous creature or cliff face caused that kind of lower body destruction. What we do know is that it forced him into a life of agonizing, hobbling steps. And just when you think it could not get worse, he shattered the bones in his right foot, making every single stride pure torture. Picture this absolute warrior, dragging his broken body through a savage world, half paralyzed, fighting through severe brain damage, and virtually blind. Oh, and did I mention he was also profoundly deaf? Massive bony growths had completely sealed off his right ear canal and practically shut down the left one entirely. Combine all of that trauma, and you have a man entirely robbed of the basic sensory experiences that make life remotely enjoyable. Even his ability to simply enjoy a meal was completely hijacked by his survival instincts. Because his arms were rendered useless, Nandy was forced to use his own mouth like a vice grip, clamping down and tearing into tough materials just to get by. This extreme wear and tear ground his teeth down to the nerve, unleashing blazing sensitivity, a wrecked jawline, and blinding, relentless headaches. Chewing his food must have felt like chewing glass. The universe had thrown everything it had at him, and he desperately deserved it. But the ancient world shows no mercy. His skeleton was riddled with a brutal condition called dish, a terrifying disease where rogue bone growths and abnormal calcification invade the body, sparking widespread agony, paralyzing rigidity, and locking up whatever mobility he still possessed. Looking at this rap sheet of horror, logic dictates that Nandy should have perished in his absolute prime. Yet, defying every law of nature, he survived. This mind-blowing resilience proves two undeniable facts. First off, somebody owed this absolute legend at least 100 ancient beers. And secondly, he absolutely possessed a dedicated support squad. There is zero chance any hominid, Neanderthal or Homo sapien, was surviving that gauntlet of injuries solo. We are talking about crippling afflictions that turned basic, everyday chores into an excruciating, impossible mountain to climb. And the evidence backs this up brilliantly. The burial cave where he was discovered held the remains of at least 10 other tribe members who undeniably acted as his full-time caretakers. It is a profound realization. This guy's survival paints a breathtaking picture of profound empathy, fierce loyalty, and genuine love within his tribe. As one top-tier paleontologist perfectly summed it up, Nandy was practically incapable of providing anything of physical value to his clan. They kept this battered warrior alive and fed simply because they valued his soul. And man, that prehistoric healthcare system was unbelievably top-notch. Nandy completely shattered the odds, pushing through to approximately 45 years of age, which absolutely made him a wise, respected elder of that harsh era. Truth be told, he was the most senior individual pulled from that entire excavation site, which is just staggering. But then again, our ancient ancestors built their entire reputation on being wildly indestructible juggernauts. I mean, you can literally look at massive prehistoric battlegrounds and see the proof, where fallen warriors display wild track records of surviving past slaughters, casually shrugging off savage spear wounds and terrifying skull-crushing blows like they were nothing more than mosquito bites, and brutal, flesh-tearing gashes that sometimes literally ripped their limbs right off their bodies. The absolute craziest part about this entire Nandy ordeal is how the experts looked at the evidence and concluded, look, there is absolutely zero way this guy made it on his own. This is undeniable proof of pack loyalty. And honestly, you could apply that exact same survival logic to another legendary beast, whose pack dynamics have always sparked massive debates. The iconic saber-toothed tiger, Smilodon. Oh yeah. Just like the absolute tyrant of the Cretaceous period, the undisputed ruler of the Ice Age took some unimaginably brutal beatings. And nowhere paints a bloodier picture of this than the La Brea tar pits, a notorious death trap that has literally handed us over 8,000 distinct records of prehistoric trauma. We are talking nasty bacterial infections, fangs snapped completely off from bone-crushing bites, shattered skeletons, and then some. But out of all that ancient carnage, there is one specific set of bones that steals the spotlight, easily standing out as the most mind-blowing survival story to ever emerge from those dark, sticky pits. Let me introduce you to specimen LACMH C131. This is the pelvic bone of a Smilodon fatalis, unearthed way back in the 1930s. And to put it gently, this thing was a complete disaster. The right hip was severely worn, twisted into an unnatural shape, and absolutely decimated. While the left side looked completely fine, which honestly just highlights exactly how terrifyingly mangled that right side truly was. Now, scientists originally figured this saber-tooth got crushed in some devastating, bone-shattering brawl. But state-of-the-art scans completely flipped the script, revealing the true culprit was a catastrophic birth defect. Right from infancy, the creature's pelvis began fusing and mutating in the absolute worst way imaginable, severely compromising the entire ball and socket mechanism. One scientific paper flat out stated the joints were completely obliterated. Needless to say, the odds were massively stacked against this ancient predator. Now, that might not sound like a guaranteed death sentence to you, considering a human with a shattered or twisted hip today can definitely live a long, full life with the right medical care. But here is the massive reality check.
These fossilized
Saber-toothed cats obviously lacked modern medicine, and they made their living hunting impossibly dangerous, skyscraper-sized megafauna like literal woolly mammoths. In that brutal world, a crippled hip meant an instant, merciless end. You cannot sprint after monstrous prey or wrestle multi-ton giants to the dirt when your legs simply do not work. And if that was not terrifying enough, this maned feline still had to fend off rival killers and hold down its territory. Trying to pull off either of those feats with practically useless hind legs is a monumental joke. And yet, in the face of impossible odds, this incredibly resilient warrior somehow survived all the way into adulthood. That is an achievement universally considered to be completely physically impossible if this apex predator had been wandering the prehistoric wastelands all by itself. Because of this jaw-dropping survival story, experts point to this exact skeleton as definitive proof that these ferocious felines ran in tight-knit, loyal packs. The theory is that its family stepped up, sharing their kills and fiercely guarding their sick companion from rival threats. Just like our friend Nandy, there is zero chance this battered beast was leading any hunting parties, even if it pushed past the sheer mechanical failure of its body. Not to mention, that mangled bone structure guaranteed the creature was battling absolute, agonizing chronic pain every single second of its life. So yeah, prehistoric mammals definitely endured nightmare-level suffering, but we need to pivot right back to the dinosaurs, because I promise you, their survival stories are even more insane. You recall that ancient marine reptile we talked about that got its entire face ripped off? Well, hold on to your hats, because there is an absolute unit of a dinosaur that had half its skull torn away and still lived to fight another day. This epic saga kicks off 67 million years ago in the legendary, blood-soaked plains of the Hell Creek Formation, starring a fully grown Edmontosaurus annectans. People completely sleep on these hadrosaurs, but they absolutely should not, because the adults were towering muscle-bound titans that regularly dwarfed modern elephants. And they were undeniably tough as nails, a fact perfectly proven by the legendary survivor we are looking at today. All we have left is its skull, or, to be totally accurate, whatever remained of its skull, because a gigantic chunk of its head was straight up missing. Getting down to the terrifying details, an entire section of its right brain case was violently sheared off. Vicious, deep drag marks surround the crater, screaming that some unstoppable, bone-shattering bite clamped down hard. And we are not just talking about a wide-surface scratch here. The wound punched unbelievably deep into the skull, exposing the vulnerable soft tissue hidden underneath. It was such a gaping hole that you could literally stare straight into the mind of this prehistoric tank. All kidding aside, calling this a catastrophic injury is an understatement of epic proportions, and the reality was a million times more gruesome than just some missing bone. Because right alongside that shattered skull, paleontologists discovered a horrifying chunk of fossilized flesh and skin. This chunk was violently peeled away from directly over the beast's right eye, and the sheer force of the impact highly suggests the eyeball itself was ripped clean out of the socket. Think about the sheer, unadulterated power required for that to happen. Something slammed into this colossus with such staggering force that it tore out chunks of solid bone, dragging heavy slabs of meat and skin right along with it. Yeah, we are talking absolute nightmare fuel. Which naturally forces us to ask the million-dollar question. What kind of demonic entity roaming the Hell Creek landscape possessed the sheer firepower to decimate a creature the size of an elephant? Honestly, there is only one suspect on that roster. The undisputed apex predator itself, a massive Tyrannosaurus Rex, locked its jaws directly onto this herbivore's face. Now, taking a direct, bone-crushing headshot from T-Rex is practically a guaranteed game over screen. Yet, miraculously, this absolute unit refused to die, with the fossilized skull showing definitive, undeniable proof of bone regrowth and healing. This stands out as a legendary example of a botched assassination in the late Cretaceous period, proving this animal somehow survived despite having half its head literally torn to shreds. So yeah, it should shock absolutely no one that When we are talking about prehistoric survival and bouncing back from massive trauma, this particular beast is absolutely legendary. But listen, you simply cannot dive into dinosaur battle scars without bringing up the ultimate prehistoric survivor, a walking disaster zone we call Big Al. If you are a fan of the ancient world, that name should ring a bell. But if it does not, get ready to meet arguably the most famous Allosaurus to ever walk the earth. Sure, scientists drool over this fossil because it is 95% intact, but the real story here is the sheer, brutal amount of punishment this predator took while it was breathing. It is like the universe itself put a bounty on this creature, because throughout its lifespan, this apex predator survived 19 devastating wounds, scattered all over its colossal body. We are talking shattered and snapped ribs, a right claw that was practically shredded, a brutal puncture wound blown straight through its shoulder blade,
toward the head of the
vicious
dying
infections
Allosaurus.
ravaging its body,
Around it,
including a
smaller
nasty one
conspecifics
rotting out its
gather-
jawbone. Growing vertebrae fused together from massive, high-speed impacts, a snapped tail, and crushed belly bones. Trust me, this meat-eater lived with unimaginable, constant agony. Experts think this absolute warrior caught these beatings from violent tumbles, desperate struggles with thrashing prey, and turf wars with rival monsters, proving that every single day in the Jurassic was a fight for survival. And it proves just how insanely unstoppable these predators were. Because get this, not a single one of those horrific wounds actually took this monster down, but every king has to fall. And wound number 19 was the fatal blow, a severely pulverized left foot, likely the result of a high-stakes hunt gone completely wrong. The shattered bones alone would have hobbled this massive beast. But the real nightmare began when a raging infection set in.
Không có
The
tĩnh
bacteria
tại,
literally
không
ate
có
away
động
at the
vật.
bone until it was rotting from the inside out, making taking a single step pure torture if it could move at all. Immobilized and agonizingly weak, this legendary titan slowly wasted away, starving to death because it simply could no longer chase down a meal. Now, the crazy twist to this tale is that decades later, paleontology crews unearthed another incredibly pristine Allosaurus and immediately slapped the same legendary nickname on it. Enter the epic sequel, Big Al 2. And in a wild twist of fate, this second powerhouse was absolutely plastered with brutal battle scars of its own. Just like the original brawler, researchers believe this second titan earned its gruesome stripes in the trenches, tearing it up with desperate prey and fierce rivals alike. It even had horrific damage across its snout, clear evidence that it was taking bone-crushing bites to the face from other massive Allosaurus challengers. However, there is one massive difference between these two legendary fighters. Number 2 also sustained a catastrophic foot injury, but somehow powered through the pain, surviving all the way to full adulthood, unlike the first, who perished as a juvenile. But the Grim Reaper always collects his dues, and in its prime, this second titan suffered a devastating fracture to its pelvis. That crucial bone anchored an entire network of powerful muscles, and once it snapped, the mighty predator was doomed. How it managed to shatter that specific bone remains a total enigma, largely because you practically never see that kind of pelvic trauma in giant, meat-eating dinosaurs. It is incredibly bizarre. Now, I could spend hours spinning yarns about battered dinosaurs, but I have to leave you with an epic story about an ancient creature that was not a dinosaur at all. Remember how the original Big Al met its end due to one wrecked foot? Obviously, if you lose the use of a leg in the wild, you are on borrowed time. And if both of your legs fail, well, it is completely game over. But imagine, just for a second, that a creature lost the use of its arms, too. At that point, survival seems totally impossible, but maybe that rule
As
only applies
highlighted
to
here in
humans.
yellow, the
Because back in
thigh, arm, and
1948,
foot bones
fossil
all
hunters
show
dug up
traces
a
of
one-of-a-kind
simultaneous
prehistoric
injury.
beast called Smilodon.
As we move closer to the
that
left
spat in the
forelimb,
face of those
the flashing
impossible
graphic
odds.
emphasizes
At
the
first
severe
glance,
polytrauma
it was
in the
not the
upper arm
horrific
joint
battle
and
damage that
adjacent
blew the
ribs.
team away.
Islets.
It was the sheer,
Here we display
breathtaking
6
size and
fragments of
pristine
fractured
condition
limb
of the
bones.
fossil. This
Note
was an
the
absolute
unusual
titan from the
dragon-jeweled
Triassic
horn
period,
styles.
a massive phytosaur that rivaled the biggest super crocodiles of later eras, with adults stretching up to 12 meters, or 39 feet long. Reaching those colossal dimensions meant this specific predator should have been an unstoppable, nightmare-inducing killing machine if it had not been cursed with some shockingly severe physical limitations. Spread across its massive frame, scientists identified 8 distinctly shattered bones, all crusted over with massive abnormal bone growths. Those gnarly calcifications happen right after taking catastrophic, bone-crushing blunt force impacts, proving this
The
ancient
neck is
river monster
protected by
endured
this
vicious
thick layer
fractures
of
that
goatskin
eventually
armor.
festered into horrific
And as you can
infections.
see,
Now,
the deep
that might
wrinkles
not
and
sound
ribbed
too
skin
insane
detail.
compared to the brawlers we just saw. But the truly unbelievable and tragic part of the story is that every single one of those 8 shattered bones was located in its legs, meaning all 4 of its limbs were completely mangled. Its left upper arm, right forearm, both thigh bones, and both lower leg bones were all destroyed, along with multiple bones in the hands and feet. We will probably never know exactly what kind of hellish onslaught left this Leviathan so absolutely wrecked. However, scientists point the finger at brutal territorial clashes, pointing out that modern reptiles frequently rip into each other's legs during vicious fights. You would logically assume that a bite from a monster this large would just tear a limb clean off, rather than simply snapping the bones beneath. But these ancient predators wore incredibly thick suits of biological armor, way tougher than any modern crocodile, meaning a rival's crushing jaws likely delivered devastating internal blunt force trauma instead of an amputation. And the one detail that absolutely seals the deal on this epic mystery. What really backs this up is the absolute impossibility of this creature taking all that damage in a single catastrophic showdown. The wounds are just too scattered for it to be some freak accident. Bottom line, this animal was cursed with some of the absolute worst luck in prehistoric history. And that terrible hand it was dealt was only made worse by the nightmare era this phytosaur called home, the late Triassic. We are talking about an unforgiving, bone-dry wasteland, continuously ravaged by massive droughts, and crawling with a terrifying lineup of rival predators. Yet, the fact that this titan did not just drop dead from one shattered limb, let alone 4, is nothing short of a prehistoric miracle. And we are not talking about scraping by for a few days either. This absolute warrior kept fighting through the agony for months on end. And get this, that timeline only starts after it took its final devastating hit. Think about that. It could have been dragging around 2, maybe even 3 mangled limbs for years before that, likely surviving only because floating around in a semi-aquatic environment took the crushing weight off its broken body. Researchers also figure its secret weapon was the incredibly sluggish metabolism these ancient reptiles possessed, an internal engine running so flawlessly slow that it could endure periods of starvation that would have easily wiped out any mammal struggling to hunt. But even with those evolutionary cheat codes, this specific beast was an absolute juggernaut, refusing to lay down and die despite an unbelievable mountain of battle scars. In fact, paleontologists widely recognize this legend as the single most banged-up, battle-damaged specimen ever discovered from the entire Triassic period. It is a brutal title I certainly do not envy, but it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt just how ridiculously indestructible these ancient monsters really were. Thank you so much for tuning into this epic tale.